do want to dive back into this week and next week what we have been looking at for almost, really even, I think, since before the month of December, the kingship of Jesus Christ. And this has taken us down many paths. We've looked at the betrayal of a king, and we've looked at the prophecies that Jesus was born to be king, and we've looked at the promise of the king, and we've looked at, as we studied about the Magi who were coming to Jerusalem to search for this promised king. Today I want to look at the rejection of this king as we come to the conclusion of this trial between the Sanhedrin and Pilate. Pilate is an interesting character study. If you've ever looked at, history hasn't reserved too much for us. When I was in Caesarea, which is on the coast of Israel, there is a few remains of basically rocks and parts of walls that have survived that has inscriptions of Pilate in there. And you can see this is where Pilate spent much of his time in Caesarea. Caesarea is a beautiful place, by the way. Caesarea and that whole region of the Mediterranean coast is just a gorgeous, gorgeous place to be. But history hasn't recorded too much for us in regards to Pilate. We know who he was. We know that he governed in this region. We know about what times. We know what Rome had to say about Pilate. But most of what we know about Pilate we find from the Gospels, which are the most trustworthy piece of historic literature that has ever existed. Some of you, I don't think, and this is extra, I shouldn't be adding more time to my sermon, but I'll throw this out. Some of you may not realize just how historically important the Gospels themselves are. They are copies of copies. John's copy is certainly no more removed than, let's say, 20, 30 years, because some of the early church fathers made copies who also knew the Apostle John. There were copies being made while the Apostle John was alive. And so by the turn of the first century, there were those who sat and listened to John. There were those who read the original writings of John. And so what you're reading in your Bible is as accurate as it can possibly be. This is not true of anything else, any other literature in antiquity. You could take the writings of Plato or Socrates. You could take, what's funny is a lot of people question whether Jesus was even a historic figure. We have more archaeological evidence. We have more literature evidence that is reserved for us in history about the existence of Jesus than we do of any emperor or any king of the past, at least in the first century Roman era. When you read the Bible, you are reading the most trustworthy historic literature that has ever been recorded. And I mean that. I don't mean that, I mean that in a secular sense, not just in a religious sense. I believe that it's the most trustworthy thing that you could ever read because it's God-inspired, and it's inerrant, and it's preserved by God for His church, for His people. But even from a secular sense, a historic sense, it is, when you read the Bible, you are reading the most accurate and the most trustworthy historic literature that has ever been produced by mankind. The reason why is because the copies of the Gospels were recorded and spread throughout all of the empire by the thousands. And this is not true of any of the edicts of the emperors. This is not true of any of the writings of the philosophers. This is not true of any of the historians. Yes, we have Josephus. Yes, we have other first century historians, but we don't have nearly the mass of copies that have been preserved throughout history as we do of the Gospels. There is nothing, literature speaking, there is nothing in history that is more trustworthy than what you read when you read the Scripture. So if you really want to know historic facts of the first century, the Bible is the best place to go to. And so when we read about Pilate here, or a little bit later we're going to talk about Barabbas, this is the source, this is the historic go-to to discover some of these people, these individuals, these places, these times, these customs of the first century. With that said, we've been looking at the trial of Jesus. And we've come to the conclusion, or at least the end of chapter number 18, where Jesus has stood before Pilate in this trial. When I say that Pilate is an interesting character study to me, he's interesting because so many people have so many different opinions about Pilate. The early church, the Coptic church, and some of the other, the Ethiopian Catholic church, there's many different branches within Catholicism that have sainted Pilate. In fact, if I remember right, June 18th and June 19th in the Coptic church is celebrated as a day to celebrate the life of Pilate. They revere Pilate. They see him as a saint and a martyr and a great person. Of course, if you study the Gospels and you pay attention to really what's going on here, you walk away with more of a perspective of Pilate that he's really more in line with Judas than he is with Jesus. Pilate represents a weak man. And we're going to see that come full in its full clarity as we think through these passages this morning, these verses here. Pilate was a very weak man. Pilate, in many ways, he represents what we often see today in modern times in modern politics. Virtually everything Pilate did in this story here is what we see repeated in Congress today. You see, and this has always been a mystery to me. I've never served in a political role, nor do I ever wish to. I have no desire to serve in any political office, but it's always been a mystery to me. How is it that people, when they get a certain amount of power, that something changes in them? They'll almost do anything to maintain that power. They'll lie, they'll cheat, and even murder at times in order to maintain the power that they've been given. And you see, you've heard the statement many, many times that absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is so true, and it has reared its ugly head so many times throughout history. This is one of those cases where you have Pilate, who has what appears to be the best intentions here at this trial, but yet that craving, that addiction for power leaves him making a decision that he knows is wrong. He knows that he's breaking the law. He breaks the law several times in this story. And he does so because he doesn't want to lose his position as governor. He doesn't want to lose his power. And he is willing to compromise again and again in order to maintain his position of authority and power, even though he knows that he's going to sentence an innocent man to death. And that's where we pick up in the story. If you're there in 18 and look at verse number 38, it says, Pilate, speaking to Jesus, said to him, "What is truth?" Because Jesus said, "I've come to bear witness to the truth that he is king." It says, "And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all." He's no threat to Caesar. He's no threat to the Roman Empire. He's no threat to my governance in the land of Judea. He's no threat to Herod in Galilee, because at this point, John's gospel doesn't record this, but chronologically at this point, Jesus has already gone to Herod, who is the governor of the Galilean region. And Herod has determined, I find no fault in this man. He's not a criminal. There's nothing wrong with him. He's done nothing wrong. And so he's come back to Pilate. Pilate has examined him. Pilate says, I find no fault in him. He's done nothing illegal. He's done nothing wrong. There's nothing worthy of punishment for him. So he brings him out before the Jews, and he presents Jesus to them once again. Now, he's at the praetorium here. You would call that, in modern terms, the governor's mansion. That's what praetorium is. That's where the governor of the land lives. But it's a little bit different. It's kind of like the governor's mansion and the courthouse together. They bring him early in the morning, around 6 a.m., to Pilate, and he's been doing this trial early in the morning. I've been to this place. I've walked these very stairs that Jesus walked up. I've walked the very stairs that are right beside it where Jesus was asked to carry his beam to the place of crucifixion. I've been into the ruins of what is now left. There's really not much left to it there, but I've been to the location here, this praetorium. And I can probably visualize this a little bit better than most of you, because I've stood in some of these locations, the platform where Pilate would have come out, the little courtyard area where the Sanhedrin would have stood. And as they go back and forth, I've actually seen in the passage here, we'll look at where they talk about where they bind Jesus and they beat him with a cat of nine tails. I've seen the very place where they tied his hands. It's still there in the rock today. It wasn't on a beam. It was in a rock up against the wall in this little gel-type area. I've seen the very place where this has taken place. So as I read this story, I can visualize it a little bit better maybe than most. And my hope, my desire this morning is to try to help you see this. Unfortunately, when you think of Jesus, a lot of times you think of what you see in the movies. And the movies don't, as you know, like the media, never really gets things that accurate. And so as we walk through these verses together, I hope that maybe you'll visualize it a little bit better. And here's the reason I want you to visualize this. And I'm going to skip to the end of my sermon right now, because I want to. Jesus is God. Jesus is King. Jesus has all authority in heaven and earth. Jesus allowed all of this to happen to him. He allowed Judas to betray him. He allowed the soldiers to arrest him. He allowed the Sanhedrin to mock him. He is allowing Pilate to judge him. He is allowing the soldiers to beat him. He is allowing them to mock him. Now why? Why? What kind of, how much power does one have to hold back? He could call down the angels of heaven to destroy them at any time. He could speak a word and they would all just fall down dead. He could do at any moment whatever he wanted to end the suffering immediately, the mockery immediately. He could end it immediately. Why does Jesus do that? Why does he at times stand there silently? Well, there's two reasons. The first is his obedience to the Father in heaven and fulfilling the providential plan to die for the sins of humanity. And that leads to the second reason, which is his great love for you. So what we're going to be reading in these verses really show the strength, the power of his love for you, particularly as an individual. I think about what Paul said in Romans chapter 5 and verse number 8, where he talks about, he proved his love to us. He demonstrated his love to us by dying for us. If you've ever questioned how much Jesus loves you, read these verses. If you ever question how much was he willing to give up for you, for your salvation, meditate on these. We read these so haphazardly. We don't really think deeply and spiritually about what he is doing here for you. So before I even, I already gave away where we're going with this sermon this morning, but I wanted to kind of lay that as a foundation so that as we read this, the impact of it is hitting you again and again and again. It's for me. He did this for me. He did this for me. So let's read this together. He says, verse number 38, Pilate says, I find no fault in him. Verse number 39. Pilate, once again, he's trying to get out of this. He's already declared Jesus innocent. Herod has declared Jesus innocent. He's trying to distance himself from Jesus and his whole situation. So he says in verse number 39, but you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews? This is Pilate's way of saying, I got to get out of this. I got to separate. This is going to turn into a mob. This is going to turn to a riot. They're going to storm my mansion. I've got to distance myself from this man. Now, notice the reaction of the people. Verse 40, they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. And who's Barabbas? So Pilate says, you have a custom. At the Passover meal every year, it is a custom of you that I release a criminal, I release a prisoner. This man is innocent. I've declared him innocent. Herod has declared him innocent. He's just, as far as we're concerned, he's a crazy man. How about I release this man? Their cry was, not this man, Barabbas. We want Barabbas. Now, John here tells us Barabbas was a robber. And some people may unfortunately just think, well, Barabbas, he's just kind of a petty theft that, someone maybe is a poor guy and maybe he was stealing bread to feed himself and his family, and they felt sympathy and sorrow for him, so they said, Barabbas, let Barabbas go and kill Jesus instead. And that's certainly not the case. Let me tell you a little bit about Barabbas. If you read all four Gospels, you get a clear picture of who Barabbas is. Matthew's account says that he was a notorious prisoner. He was renowned and known throughout all of the Jewish region. Mark's account says that he was chained with his fellow rebels. He wasn't a prisoner that had been arrested by himself. He was arrested with an entire group of rebels. And Luke's account tells us that he was thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. Mark's account tells us that they had committed murder in the rebellion. You're starting to get a clearer picture of this individual. He wasn't just some petty thief. This was an insurrectionist. This was a revolutionary leader who banded other rebels together, who attacked Rome and Roman soldiers. This is a notorious rebel. This is a murderer, perhaps not even just one murder, maybe many murders of, no doubt, Roman soldiers. This is a thief. This is a man who is a threat to Caesar. He is a threat to Pilate. He is a threat to Herod. He is a threat even to the Jewish people, because if these rebels are allowed to start a revolutionary war, that means that all of Israel will be at war, and that would come with it a lot of death and sorrow and pain, which eventually did happen. In the mid-60s, there was the Jewish revolt that led to the collapse of Jerusalem in 70 AD by General Titus. And so this ultimately does lead to the sad sorrow and the hurt and the death of the Jewish people. But what you have here, you have an insurrectionist of the highest level. And the Jewish people are saying, well, once again, let me remind you, what did they accuse Jesus of? They bring him to Pilate and say he's an insurrectionist. And he is going to declare himself king and try to go against Caesar, so you should kill him. That was their argument. And yet, what do? The irony here. What do? They turn around to Pilate and they said, release Barabbas, the notorious insurrectionist, the man who has already gathered a rebel group of people together, who has already committed murder, who has already displayed acts of violence towards Rome. They say, let him go free and kill Jesus instead. What hypocrisy. The sheer level of hypocrisy is mind-numbing at this point. Now, I find Barabbas, though, to be symbolic, though. If you read in the Greek, the gospel accounts, it becomes very clear that Barabbas was kind of his surname. His first name, oddly enough, is Jesus. You have two Jesuses here, Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Son of God, and you have Jesus Barabbas. Now, Barabbas is an interesting name itself. Barabbas means son of the Father. You have Jesus, Son of the Father, and Jesus, Son of God, on trial here. And so when Pilate says, should I release Jesus the Christ to you? They say, no, release to us Jesus, Son of the Father. So the dynamics here are very interesting to me. It's some very symbolism that is being displayed here. And so you have the Jewish people who are saying, no, give us the true insurrectionists and put our Christ, put the Messiah to death. They know he's the Messiah. They know that he's the Christ. So they say, we don't want him. We'd rather have a murderer. We'd rather have a thief. We'd rather have someone that will lead us into true war against Rome. Which, by the way, this is all they wanted. This was all the Jewish people wanted. The reason they wanted Jesus to be the Messiah is because they wanted a general to lead them against Caesar. They wanted someone to rally an army to attack Rome and to win back their freedom and independence. That's what they wanted. And as it became very, very clear that Jesus was not the man and that he was not going to do that, they said, well, crucify him and give us Barabbas. Barabbas will lead us. Barabbas will give us an insurrection. Barabbas will give us a war. Now, history, unfortunately, doesn't really tell us much about what happens to Barabbas. But history does tell us that within a few years, the rebels will continue to grow. The insurrectionist power will continue to gain momentum. And that by the year 60 A.D., the Jewish people themselves will arise to a revolt against Rome. In my humble opinion, I would say Barabbas had a significant part in that. He's already a leader of rebels. He is already loved and has inspiration within the Jewish people. All it takes is him to be freed and to come among the Jewish people and say, let's finish what we've started. Let's continue the work. And eventually they do. And so here we have the conclusion of chapter number 18. But if you look at verse number 1 of chapter 19, it says this. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. Now that's not what they asked, is it? We want him crucified. Now why is Pilate choosing instead to turn him over to be crucified? He's going to scourge him. Now scourging, that's another way of saying to be beat with a cat of nine tails. For the Jewish people, they had a rule that according to the Levitical law, you could only beat someone with a whip for 40 times, and so for the Jewish people, they restricted it to 39 so that they never, went over 40. But the Romans, they had no rule like that. And their rule was basically until the prisoner passes out or until he dies, which this would happen very regularly. The cat of nine tails, it's 9 strips of thin leather attached to a wood handle. And along those strips of leather, they would have tied into it little balls of metal, and they would also have sharp pieces of bone that are attached every couple of inches into these cat of nine tails. It was meant to lacerate the body of the individual that they were slinging it against. So think of it this way. Think of these metal strips or these leather strips coming around with the metal balls attached to them. They would wrap around the body. The sharp pieces of bone, as it wrapped around the body, would stick themselves into the skin. And this is when the soldier then would pull back as hard as he could. So it was meant to go around the body, attach itself to the body, and then they would rip as hard as they could. They would do this over and over until either they were tired or until the person that they were whipping passed out or died, which was very common. Many prisoners never made it to the cross. They died during the whipping of the cat of nine tails. This is not like getting whipped with a belt. This was intent to bring immense suffering and pain. Jesus, after this whipping, would have been entirely bloodied. There are historic accounts of where even their organs would be exposed. You have to think about all of the skin as being ripped back, pulled apart. Not to be too gruesome, but I want you to understand what's going on here. Why does Pilate do this? He has already declared Jesus innocent. Herod has declared Jesus innocent. They are the law of the land. What we're witnessing here in verse number 1 of chapter number 19 is Pilate in his first compromise with the law. He has been trying to follow the law up to this point, but he's getting nowhere with the Jewish leaders. A revolt is about to happen. An angry mob is yelling at him. They won't leave his house. He cannot get them to go away. And so he begins to compromise his own conscience. He compromises the law of the land, and he has Jesus scourged, hoping that after he's bloodied and beaten and battered, he could bring him out and show them this grotesque-looking human being and say, are you satisfied? Is this good enough for you? I don't want to sentence him to death. Is this good enough for you? And that's exactly what's taking place here. It's very brutal. It is extremely brutal. Isaiah 52 and verse number 14 tells us prophetically that he was beaten so much that you would not even recognize him. Remember that the soldiers, they're punching him in the face. They're plucking his beard. It says in verse number 2, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. These are these long desert thorns from the trees there in the Judean region. They twisted it together. They placed it on his head. You got to remember, when you think of a crown, when it comes to the Romans, they didn't wear golden crowns. They wore wreaths. This is what Caesars wore, these little wreaths. This was meant to make him look like Caesar, but not with a wreath, not with what a typical king of the era and time would wear, but with a crown of thorns pressed down into his head. He would have been bleeding into his face. His face would have been bruised and swollen and battered. It says that they put on him a purple robe. They did this to mock him. You know, it's very fitting to me that they put a crown of thorns on his head. If you read Genesis chapter 3 and verse number 18, the very first curse that God had put after mankind's sin was that the earth would produce thorns and thistles. And what is Jesus doing at the cross? What is he doing at this scene? He is taking on the curse of man. He is taking on the sins of humanity, something that began in the garden. And here symbolically it's being represented once again. And they're making a mockery of this. Matthew records that they had given him a reed and called it a scepter. And they had put this purple robe on him, which represented what a king would wear, and this crown of thorns, what a king would wear. And they put the scepter, this reed, in his hand, and he's there, he's bloodied, he's battered, and they mock him as being king. And Matthew's account says that they took the scepter out of his hand, they took the reed out of his hand, and they began to beat his face with it. Now, once again, let me point out that even what the soldiers are doing is not legal. It's like they had a lapse of any moral sense at this moment. Everyone involved seems demonic at this point. Everyone seems to have lost control of their senses. And they're just mocking a man that they've never met and they don't know. It says at the end of, or verse number 3 rather, then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. Verse number 4 says, Pilate then went out again. This is the third time that he has gone out to the Jewish people. Now, we're beginning to get a sense now that Pilate is losing control of this. He's in control, but he has no control. He is the authority of the land, but because he is a weak man, he just can't seem to do what's right. He alone has the one who can bring the judgment. And yet he just can't seem to bring himself to do it. And so the third time he comes out, it says, and he said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Now he's already told them that 2 times. It's the third time again. It's like, okay, I've beat him, even though he's done nothing wrong. So now you have caused me to beat a man who is innocent. Are you happy? Are you satisfied? It says in verse number 5, then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." This is Pilate's way of trying to appease them. It's a dog and pony show at this point. He's beaten, he's bruised, he's bloodied, he's near death. You know, we're making a mockery of him as king. We put this crown on him, this robe on him. You know, he's a man. I'm straying away from using the term king now. Behold this man. He's not a king. He's not your king. I'm not implying he's your Messiah. He's just some crazy man. Are you happy? Are you satisfied? Verse number 6. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" No, we're not happy. We don't want him beat. We don't want him bruised. We want him dead. We want him dead. That's all they want. They're madmen at this point. Nothing matters. All they can think is him dead. Him dead now. And they're not going to leave until it happens. fact, as you read this story, it becomes very clear that Pilate has no control over the situation. They do. They're the ones controlling everything that's going on. So they say, crucify him. Pilate said to them, this is the second compromise of the law, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. Now, they have no legal authority to do so. That has been removed from them the previous year. They can't bring capital punishment, and they know that. Pilate knows that, but Pilate's at the end of his rope here. He's like, you crucify him. You know, I'm not going to do this. You break the law with me. You want this done? I'll turn a blind eye to it, and I won't prosecute you. I won't tell Caesar. I won't tell Rome. We'll just act as if this never happened, and hopefully everything goes away. They responded, verse number 7, the Jews answered, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God. Now, there's so many cults out there that have tried to make their arguments and claims that Jesus never claimed to be God. He never claimed to be the Son of God. And yet, here you have, once again, of the umpteenth time, as we've studied through the Gospel of John, even the Sanhedrin themselves are admitting he claimed to be the Son of God. He said he was the Son of Man, which is a messianic term from Daniel's account, saying that he's the Christ. He claimed to be the Christ. He claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to be equal with the Father over and over again. So they said, we have a law, and according to our law, he has blasphemed. The law they're referring to is most likely Leviticus 24, verse 16. It says, whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him, the stranger as well as him who is born in the land. When he blasphemes the name of the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death. This is the law that they're referring to. He has blasphemed. He has claimed to be equal with God. He has claimed to be the Son of God, and according to our law, he should be taken outside the walls and he should be stoned to death. Now, once again, Jesus did claim to be the Son of God. He did claim to be the Christ. He did claim to be equal with the Father, and no, he did not blaspheme, because all of those things are true. And they knew it to be true, but they did not want him to be that individual. Verse number 8 says, therefore, when Pilate had heard that saying, he was the more afraid. Now that's odd, you might think. Why was Pilate afraid? What puts terror in his heart that now that they're saying he has claimed to be the Son of God? You got to remember, Pilate is Roman, Greco-Roman. The Greek gods and the philosophies and the ideas of the Greco-Roman Empire are very strong still in the first century here. And so when they say that he's the Son of a God, that's, in Pilate's eyes, it's like, oh, am I dealing with an earthly half-breed man deity like Thor or some other of the Greek gods? And so he said, what am I dealing with here? Now don't forget, in Matthew's account, Matthew 27, Pilate's wife comes to him in the middle of the trial. This has already happened at this point, but early in the trial, Pilate's wife comes to him and tells Pilate, I've had a dream tonight, and I have been terrorized in my dream because of this righteous man. You should have nothing to do with him. You should have nothing to do with this righteous man. I've seen it in my dreams. So Pilate already has that on the back of his mind. My wife has just told me earlier that this man's righteous. In her dreams, she was terrorized. I shouldn't have anything to do with this individual. And now I'm hearing from the Sanhedrin that he's the Son of God. He's part deity. What's going on here? Am I about to crucify someone that can truly use some supernatural power against me? And so he comes to Jesus in verse number 8. It says, therefore, when Pilate heard the saying, he was the more afraid, and he went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, where are you from? Now, he is not asking where did he live. He already knows that he's a Galilean. He already knows that he's from the north. He already knows all of the history about Jesus. That's already been discussed. He is asking Jesus spiritually, are you from heaven? Are you from the spiritual realm? Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Now there's two possible reasons why Jesus, or maybe both are true, I guess you could argue, why Jesus didn't answer him. He's asking a very pertinent question here. He's asking a very important question. Where are you from? And he's speaking in a spiritual sense. Jesus could have I'm from heaven. Now, I would argue that Jesus didn't answer Pilate for two reasons. One is because Jesus has already answered Pilate. Chapter 18, verse number 36 and 37, he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." He's already said that I am of the spiritual realm. I am of heaven. My kingdom is of heaven. He's already declared to Pilate where he's from. And there's a kind of a universal truth when it comes to God. If God has already revealed truth to you, and you have rejected it, or you have ignored it, or you have denied it, He's not going to give you more truth. God only gives you more light when you've received the light that He's given you already. Pilate has already been informed by Jesus who he is. He ignored that. Jesus is not going to tell him again. He doesn't have to. But I would argue that this is also because Jesus knows that all of what was prophesied concerning him in Isaiah 53 would come true. The prophet Isaiah said in Isaiah 53 in verse number 6, "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." That is the description that was given of the Messiah to come in the future. And it was said some 700 years before Jesus was born. And here's Jesus before Pilate. It is being fulfilled. So Pilate said to him, "Why are you not speaking to me? Do you not know," into verse number 10, "do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" No, you do not. You're a mere man. You are a pawn in the grand scheme of things. But Pilate seems to think that I can let you go. Of course, we know that's not true. Even in the situation that we're currently in, he has already declared him innocent 3 times. Why have you not let him go? I'll tell you why, because the Sanhedrin has power over you. Technically, it is the Sanhedrin who's in control. You're afraid of them. You're terrified of what they might do to you. And so they're technically the ones that are in power here, not you. But he says, I could let you go. I could keep you from being crucified. I could release you. Now, that statement breaks Jesus' silence. In verse number 11, Jesus answered, "You have no power at all against me." I want to pause there for just a moment. Yes, Pilate does have power. He is given civil authority. Romans 13 tells us that the governing officials have civil authority, even to capital punishment. That is an authority that God gives to individual men. Whether they are wicked or righteous is irrelevant. God has given that authority for civil government in the world that we live in. Yes, Pilate does have that governing power. The Bible's very clear on that. But the point that Jesus is making is this, is you have no power at all against me. You may have power to execute capital punishment with whomever you wish, but not with me. You can sentence anyone to death whenever you want. You have that power. You are the governor of Israel. You can do that, but not with me. I'm the governor of the universe. I'm the king of the world. I'm the creator of all things. You do not hold that kind of authority over me. And he goes on to say, unless it had been given to you from above. And it wasn't, was it? God did not give Pilate that authority. And so Jesus says, no, you don't have that kind of power. You may with others, but not with me, unless it was given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Now, this is Jesus pointing out who's really on the day of judgment has the most to answer for. It's interesting to me, and I'm guilty of this as well, how often we look at the narrative story of the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and we always look to Judas as the greatest enemy. We say, well, Judas, he's the real bad guy. And yet, when you read these verses, it becomes very clear that Judas isn't the real bad guy. Who hired Judas? Who is the person who gave Judas 30 pieces of silver? And it wasn't Pilate. Pilate's doing everything he can to get out of this situation. He finds himself between a rock and a hard place. Who's really the bad guy in all of this? It is Caiaphas. It is the Sanhedrin. But particularly Caiaphas, because he is the high priest. He is the one who is egging on the crowds, by the way. He's the one out there saying, crucify, come on, everybody, crucify him, say it with me, crucify him, crucify him. He's the one out there trying to get people to bring Jesus to death. He is the one who is dishing out the money to Judas to pay 30 pieces of silver in order to betray Jesus. He is the one who has been telling all of those that are the temple police and those that are of the Pharisees and Sadducees, if you see him, let us know, we will arrest him. He is the one orchestrating all of the crimes and the evil that's going on. And so Jesus says he's the one who is creating and doing and accomplishing the greater sin, not you. Ultimately, it's all on his shoulders. Verse number 12, it says, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. Now, that is the most odd statement in the whole story to me. It says, from then on, Pilate. The reason this is odd to me is because Jesus just insulted Pilate. He literally just told Pilate, you have no authority over me. You cannot kill me. You cannot crucify me. You have no ability to have any authority over me. He just told Pilate that. And what was Pilate's response? From that point on, he wants him released. Why is that? I can think of no other reason other than Pilate saw the eyes and the truthfulness of Christ as he spoke it and believed it. That when Jesus spoke that with great authority, Pilate saw deep into the soul of Christ and said, I don't want to have anything to do with this. So from that point on, he sought to release him. Oh, but these famous 3 words, but the Jews. Pilate did all he could to get out of this, but the Jews were not going to have it. It says, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. If you don't know what that is, that's called blackmail. That is, we're not leaving your front porch until you do what we tell you to do. And if you don't murder this man, like we're telling you to murder this man, we'll go higher up. We'll go to Caesar. And we'll tell him that you let an insurrectionist free, which he did. His name was Barabbas. But we'll tell him that we'll go to Caesar and say, Pilate is not looking out for your best interests. You need to get rid of him. And so once again, here you have the political dynamics being put to use here, where they're blackmailing Pilate and say, if you don't do what we tell you to do, you're going to lose your job. We're going to make sure that you lose your job. And Pilate, being a weak man and not wanting to lose power, he unfortunately does what they ask of him. Verse number 13 says, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out, sat him down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover. This is the Friday before the Sabbath. The preparation day is always a day to... You have to understand, the Jews, they do no work, 0 work on Saturday. And so if you're going to eat on Saturday, you have to prepare your meals on Friday. If you're going to take care of your animals and things like that, all of the preparation for that has to be done on Friday, so that on Saturday, none of that has to be accomplished. So this is speaking of a high holy day, a Passover Sabbath that is being spoken of here. It tells us, this is John speaking because John's an eyewitness. He's here. He says, it is about the 6th hour. 6th hour being what we would call 12 p.m., noon. This is a Roman time here. Now, some would argue that, a lot of Bible scholars would argue that there's a contradiction in the Scripture, because in Mark's account, he says that this took place at the 3rd hour, which would be around 9 a.m. So there's a discrepancy here. Mark says it happened at 9 a.m., and John's account says it happened at 12 p.m., And so the Bible can't be trusted because there's inaccuracy there. Well, let me clarify some of this from a historic perspective. In the antiquity time, when people didn't walk around with wristwatches and they didn't have time clocks on the wall, and unless you were standing by the sundial, nobody typically knew exactly what time it was. And so the way you determined time was by increments of time, typically around 3 hours was the general, because you could figure out about where the sun is at, and so you can kind of determine about what time of day it is. And this is how people talked. And so if one account says 9 a.m., that's any time within 3 hours. Another account says 12 p.m., that's any time within 3 hours. They don't know exactly what time it is. They can't know exactly what time it is unless they're, once again, standing beside the sundial, which nobody did. And so they would just kind of speak and say, around this time, and this is exactly, by the way, what it says. It says about the 6th hour. I don't know if it was the 6th hour. I don't know if it was 12 p.m., but it's about this time. So we could argue that Jesus was turned over to be crucified anytime between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. By the way, this is verified historically. Archaeologically, by the way. We'll find out later on that in this account that while he is being crucified, the world goes dark. And it wasn't because of an eclipse. The Passover takes place every year at a full moon. It's impossible for there to be a full eclipse during a full moon. And none of the authors, none of the writers of history's past that described this event of the world going dark described it as an eclipse. They know what an eclipse is. None of them described it as that. They described it as a mystery, that the world just went dark. Don't know why it went dark. And they described the time of which it happened. And when you collaborate the different witnesses around the world who talked about this, it all collaborates perfectly with the gospel accounts here. So around anywhere between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. here, it says that he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." One last time to mock the Jews. Verse 15. But they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" These last words of verse 15 have to be the bottom of the barrel. We have witnessed the low of the low when it comes to the Sanhedrin, but this is when they're getting to about as evil and despicable as you could possibly get to this point. The chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Which, by the way, that statement alone is blasphemous for them. Judges 8, verse 23, 1 Samuel 8, verse number 7, Psalm 149, verse number 2, Isaiah 33, verse number 22, all make it very clear the nation of Israel has one king. It is God. For Caiaphas, the high priest, to look to Pilate and say, "We have no king but Caesar, the Roman emperor." That's blasphemy. Jesus never committed blasphemy, but Caiaphas certainly did. Caiaphas certainly did. We have no king but Jesus. Such sad words. But yet, we find this to be pretty much consistent with the nation of Israel. In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel rejected God the Father as their king. They said, "We want Saul instead." In the New Testament, the nation of Israel rejected God the Son as their king. And they said, "We want Barabbas instead." To this very day, the nation of Israel is rejecting God, the Father, and their Son as their king. And in doing so, they reject the Holy Spirit as well. This is part of their tradition, I guess you could say, as a nation. And unfortunately, it is true for us as well. Not only do we often reject Jesus as king, but we want someone else to take his place. Political figures, hobbies, relationships, careers. There's all kinds of things that we choose to replace Jesus as king. I want to close with verse number 16, and then we'll pray. Verse 16 says, "Then he delivered," this is Pilate, "him to them to be crucified. Then they," that's the Sanhedrin, "took Jesus and led him away." Two times the phrase "then." Then he delivered, then they took. This is a pivotal moment in human history. There are a lot of important moments in history. This is certainly one of those. We already know the time stamp of when this took place during the day, sometime between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. We know exactly what day and what year this took place too. That's verified historically. So you could say, verse number 16, when it says then, what is the then? The then is sometime between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. on Friday, April the 5th, in the year 30 A.D. A very pivotal moment in human history on April the 5th when Jesus was turned over to be led away and to be crucified. Now, I want to remind you again. In fact, let's look at two more verses. Turn to John chapter 10. We'll read these and bring it to a conclusion. John chapter number 10. In case you forget who's really in control, in case you forget what is really going on, I want to end with these verses from John 10 and Jesus' own words. John chapter 10, verse number 11, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Look at verse 18. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This commandment I have received from the Father. Who's in control? Is it Herod? Is it Caesar? Is it Pilate? Is it Caiaphas? Who's really in control? Who, weeks before this event even took place, already declared what will happen? It is Jesus. It is Jesus who told his disciples, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to be rejected by the people, I'm going to be arrested by the Romans, I'm going to be crucified, but be of good cheer. I will resurrect on the third day. Why is that? Because he has the power and he alone to lay his life down, and he alone has the power to resurrect his life. Jesus is not in the grave. He is not dead. He is not a figment of our imagination. He is not some entombed historic figure of the past. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords who is sitting on his throne as I speak right now. And you, just like Pilate and the Sanhedrin, have a choice to make this morning, either to receive him as king or accept the consequences of rejecting him as king. History tells us that shortly after this, Pilate commits suicide. We know how it happens to the Sanhedrin. They're completely annihilated in just a few years. You can, and that's just physically, that has nothing to do with their spiritual condemnation of their souls. They sold their souls on this day for a little bit more power. They sold their souls on April the 5th in the year 30 A.D. so that they could remain in power for just a smidget more time and lose their souls. What profit does it gain anyone to gain the world and lose their soul? What a foolish thing to do. And that some of you may even make that choice this morning. I hope it's not true. But for the rest of us, we can walk away this morning rejoicing, knowing that our King is not dead and that this world has no power over our King. He is ruler. He is true. He is good. And he is our Savior. And he will come again for us. Amen?